What I want to talk about this evening on Talk is whether or not we need to look at having the ultimate deterrent in this country, which for me is the death penalty. Now, this teacher who sexually abused and murdered the 30-month-old baby boy has been sentenced today. He is going to prison for the rest of his life. They call it a whole life order. And it means that Jamie Varley, 37, will never leave prison, except in exceptional, compassionate circumstances. Is that enough? Has justice been done? This really, really shakes my belief that we should not have the death penalty in this country to the core. We used to have it in this country. It was suspended in 1965. It was permanently ended in 1969. The argument against even having the conversation about the death penalty is quite simply that we've had miscarriages of justice in the past. The list is pretty chunky. Guildford 4, Birmingham 6 are the obvious examples given. Men who were convicted of terrorism, of blowing bombs up that killed innocent people. And it turned out that the evidence used was very, very shaky. So people say, well, if you get miscarriages of justice, putting people in prison is one thing, killing them is another, particularly if they're innocent. So that's the argument. Can we have the honest conversation tonight here on Talk? 0344 499 1000. I accept this is a very extreme situation. This is a tragedy. There's a lot of speculation it could have been avoided if social services had done their jobs better, and we'll find out more about that over the next several months. But when you read about this case, and I'm sorry, you're going to read about it in great detail in tomorrow's newspapers, it is horrific, it is heartbreaking, it's tragic, and quite honestly, when I read about what happened here, I'm not convinced that a whole life order in prison is the answer. 0344 499 1000, because I'm wondering here whether or not, if we had the death penalty in this country, would it be enough of a deterrent to stop these kind of crimes? That is what I'm wondering, and I want you to tell me whether or not you think it might make a difference going forward in this country and stopping some of the most horrific crimes an adult can do to a child. 0344 499 1000 is the number, because I'm conflicted about this. I'm massively conflicted. I don't know what the answer is. I really don't. But when I read the details of this case, my heart breaks and I get angry, and I know you will be angry. And you find yourself thinking, well, maybe if we had the death penalty in this country, these kind of crimes would not happen. 0344 499 1000. Let's get a couple of views on this. Joining us on Talk on the Evening Exchange is Liam Kotrie, Executive Director at Mary Monson Solicitors, and investigative journalist and former prisoner David Shipley. Welcome both.
Stephen Duncan.
Thank you both for joining us. I'll go with you, Liam, first of all. I mean, clearly you've heard what I've had to say. It's in a very emotive case. I make no apologies for wanting to talk about it tonight on Talk, because I think it's important we have this debate. And extreme cases like this make people react in an extreme way, understandably. Is there any argument for a country to have the death penalty?
You asked the right questions, Duncan. Is the whole life sentence enough? No, it can never be enough. It can never be enough for society. It can never be enough for anyone who cared for this child. It could never be enough for the child itself. It's awful, horrific, like you say, horrific, heinous crime. You also ask about deterrent. Would it be a deterrent? Well, statistics suggest that death penalty is not a deterrent. Will it give retribution to anyone? Well, in any circumstances, to heal the murder, the killing, the violation of a loved one, a killing of another, I would suggest could never do that, could never fill that hole. In fact, philosophers argue that the anticipation of the death penalty alone is disproportionate to the offence that they may have caused. But then you talked about miscarriages of justice, and this is the one where every argument wins here. We only have to look at recent circumstance of Andrew Malkinson, 17 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, and not murder. But the crime of rape is so incredibly serious. On this particular one, he had served 17 years, not finished his sentence. Yeah. A particularly horrific case. But of course, he didn't do it. And say he murdered or was accused of murdering that person, then not only would have an innocent man been killed, but we never would have known he never would have appealed.
Yeah.
His solicitors wouldn't have done the work. Investigators wouldn't have done the work to discover the further DNA. I could go on. It's expensive. The Americans spend billions on death penalty cases where people don't even end up being executed.
No.
In the last 50 years, 130 inmates.
Okay, so convince me,
I could
Liam,
go on and on.
You could, and I appreciate your time so far this evening. Convince me and my listeners and my viewers here at Talk that that there is no other way of having such a deterrent that might stop these kinds of crimes happening. Because even if someone knows they're going to get the ultimate punishment in terms of life in prison, clearly that is not enough of a deterrent to stop these kinds of crimes, right? So are you utterly convinced that despite the whole life sentence, spending a whole life in prison, being in place, clearly that's not a deterrent. You are utterly convinced on the argument of potential miscarriages of justice that we should never have the death penalty back in this country?
Well, I didn't say that prison is not a deterrent. However, I do sway in that direction.
Okay.
In my experience, rehabilitation while within prison can help. Rehabilitation otherwise, community orders and so on.
Do you think everyone's able to be rehabilitated?
I think there's hope for all of us, Duncan. I think there are some people who are past rehabilitation. Okay. That's why whole life orders exist.
Understood. Let's bring in David Shipley on this. David, that's quite interesting. I saw your facial expression. Some of our viewers on YouTube might have clocked it as well. The idea that potentially there's hope for everyone to be rehabilitated. You kind of grimaced a little bit there. What's your take on this?
Yeah, look, I'm a Christian, and I do believe everyone is, I hope, capable of redemption, but that doesn't, I think, apply in terms of earthly justice. And you know, we all agree. Liam was just saying that a whole life order isn't enough. It cannot possibly compensate for the horror of this crime or other similar crimes. The question is then, what should we do and why? And I think there's a mistake here. Actually, the value and the point of capital punishment is not necessarily to deter. It's actually about society saying, we are sending a moral signal. There are some crimes, such as the torture and sexual abuse of a child to the point they die, a baby to the point they die,
yep,
which are utterly unforgivable. And the only appropriate response for a civilized nation is to hang those men. And, you know, Liam was talking about this great cost. Well, in the American system, that's true. But actually, if you look at when Britain had the death penalty, it wasn't expensive. Men like this would be hanged within a couple of weeks of being found guilty, having allowed time for an appeal. And the issue of, you know, what if there are miscarriages of justice? The thing is, we could very easily define the death penalty as only applicable in certain circumstances. It might not even be necessarily the case every time someone takes a life. It could and should simply be for particularly sadistic crimes where guilt is in an absolute certainty and where there is no possible prospect of rehabilitation. So I'm thinking men like these two. People like Axel Ruda Cabana, you know, Wayne Couzens, these people who have committed appalling crimes, there's no question at all of their guilt. Of course, the right thing to do is to execute them, because the alternative is not cost-free. The alternative we have right now is we house very many men like this in high-security prisons, which are very dangerous and very violent. And lots of people in society, many viewers, sit there hoping that one day someone like Varley, this baby killer, will be killed by another prisoner. And he may well be. But that's not a just or civilized way to do it. And actually, in doing that, we also create an environment where prison staff are at regular risk of assault and are often attacked by these people. So the argument in favour of the death penalty is often that, well, these days we can just permanently incapacitate people by putting them in prison, and that then they can't do any more crimes.
Yeah.
That's only a reasonable argument if you don't think that prison officers are people. Okay. And I'm afraid they are. Okay. And therefore, actually, rather than spending £100,000 a year for as many years it takes before someone like Varley is killed by another prisoner, we should just own our moral choice as a society, recognise that actually what we all will is the execution of men like this. And that is the right thing to do. And we should enact that in law and do it in a civilised fashion swiftly after conviction.
OK. Liam, convince David that he's wrong.
A civilized society, David. A Christian education is something that I had as well. I think it was number 6 on those stone tablets that said, "Thou shalt not kill." I didn't realize we're specifically talking about hanging. Now, are we talking about hanging so the neck breaks immediately, or should we wait for them to...
Of course we're going to hang in the way so the neck breaks immediately, in the professional way that we always did in Britain.
In the professional way, the civilized way.
Of course, we're not talking about anything that is egregious or cruel. It's a swift death done professionally, as it was for very, very many centuries in this country.
And the civilized society, when we later find out that they were in fact innocent, what do we do about those?
Well, I've already addressed that. So I said we would only have the death penalty in cases where guilt is beyond question. So Axel Ruda Cabana, caught at the scene, these two men today who actually filmed their sexual abuse of this baby, where there is absolutely no question of doubt, and maybe we would have to allow juries the right to either convict on an absolute certainty or beyond reasonable doubt basis, but these are perfectly solvable problems. I'm not suggesting for a moment we should execute every single person who might once have committed a crime, but there are very reasonable ways of solving these problems, particularly in the era of DNA and ubiquitous CCTV. These arguments against the death penalty, I'm afraid, are 60 or 70 years out of date, and we can actually do this in an effective way now and not have these problems.
They're certainly not. We can't start adding different kinds of verdicts. It's hard enough.
Of course we can. Why not?
The system to cope in the system that it is now, and I will explain. If a jury is left with two verdicts that you can get, that is, in fact, only recently in Scotland, not proven, I think, was a third verdict a jury could give. And
they've had that in Scotland for a very long time.
Because it's simply too complicated for a jury, and there were miscarriages of justice. That's exactly the same thing that would happen here. Innocent people will die, and who will decide whether are we really going to put it in the hands of the jury in those circumstances to give the death penalty? Because that's effectively what you're doing, or certainly giving the judge opportunity to. It can't be.
No, we would be trusting the jury to decide guilt.
They can decide right and wrong. They can decide right and wrong, and they can decide guilt and innocence. But if you're giving them a third choice of definitely guilty, i.e., judge, you can execute this person if you want, it will raise all sorts of different issues within a jury. You are telling that jury you have the power to allow a judge to execute this person. Again, it's just something that won't work. And you talk about
it worked for centuries.
And you talk about prison officers.
Capital crimes
you talk about prison officers. And I've read your article, in fact, in the Spectator. You talk and the totality of your argument within that article is that it's just too much trouble. Prison officers shouldn't have to deal with violence against sex offenders and
no. Sorry, forgive me. My argument is that prison officers do not deserve to operate in an environment where they are regularly assaulted and at risk of being killed by these very dangerous men in our dangerous prisons. It's not they shouldn't be bothered. It's about the risk to the lives and physical safety of prison officers, and that is ignored so often in this debate.
I agree entirely, and I've been on this channel and others talking about more money required in the prison system and criminal justice system.
Money does not solve it. The reality is when you have...
It certainly does, because the prisons are overcrowded.
Our high security and long-term estate isn't overcrowded. That's not the case at all. The issue in the high security and long-term estate has nothing to do with overcrowding. It's a common misconception amongst people who don't really understand the prison system. Actually, in the high security, evidently not. You think the high security and long-term estate is overpopulated. The data doesn't show that at all. So I suggest you review the data and then reflect on that. The actual situation is that estate is very dangerous because it is incredibly hard to run a prison system in which you allow human rights to these very, very dangerous men. They are given the same basic access to regime as people elsewhere in the prison system, and somehow to stop them committing acts of violence.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to interrupt and thank you both for two persuasive arguments. Before you both go, David, if you'd be kind enough in a sentence, can you sum up why you think we should be looking at reinstating the death penalty in the United Kingdom?
I think it's very simple. A civilized society recognises that some acts are utterly unforgivable in this world, and therefore a civilized society hangs men who rape and torture babies to death.
OK, thank you for your time. Liam, your final words?
A civilized society does not kill people for convenience or any other circumstance unless it's to defend themselves, and nothing today has persuaded me otherwise.
All right, gentlemen, thank you for your time on this Thursday evening. Thank you for joining us on Talk.